and a very good morning, distinguished guests and participants. Welcome to the launch of the 25th edition of the Malaysia Economic Monitor, Staying Afloat. Thank you all for joining us this morning. For today's session, we will have welcoming remarks by Dr. Endiami Diop, Country Director for Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand at the World Bank Group, followed by the official address and launch of our report by Yang Berhormat Dr.Muhamad, Minister in the Prime Minister's Department in charge of the economy. We will then have the presentation of our report by Dr. Apurva Sanghi, our lead economist, macroeconomics, trade and investments, and Dr. Ririn Salwa Purnamasari, senior economist, poverty and equity at the World Bank Group. We will then have our panel discussion moderated by Dr. Amanina Abdul Rahman, economist, social protection and jobs. We are honored to host a distinguished panel of speakers to further explore our report recommendations today. And finally, closing our launch event today is Dr. Yasuhiko Matsuda, Country Manager for Malaysia, World Bank Group. Throughout the session, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat or comments section. We also encourage you to leave your feedback for our lunch event using the Slido function, which will appear in the chat box throughout this morning's event. Without any further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Endiami Diop to deliver his opening remarks. Please, Endiami, the floor is yours.
YB Dato Sri Mustafa bin Mohamad, Minister in the Prime Minister's Department, distinguished panelists, dear guests, audience watching us online, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, Selamat Pagi. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of the World Bank's 25th Malaysia Economic Monitor, Keeping Afloat, the biannual flagship report of the World Bank Malaysia office. In addition to reviewing recent economic development and analyzing the near-term outlook of the Malaysian economy, this report takes a deep dive into how the pandemic has affected low-income households and vulnerable groups, such as informally employed workers in Malaysia. The report also looks at the gaps in the existing social protection system, as well as the impact of school closures in exacerbating existing educational disparities. The Malaysian economy was severely hit by the third wave of the pandemic, which prompted strict mobility restrictions until very recently. The closure of most economic sectors led to a 4.5% contraction of the economy in the third quarter of 2021. While the reopening of the economy and relatively strong external demand are expected to facilitate economic recovery next year, the economic shock has exacerbated the hardships that the poor and the vulnerable were already facing before the arrival of COVID-19. Looking beyond Malaysia, the pandemic continues to hinder economic activity in Asia, the Americas, and Europe. The recent rise of infection in Europe, coupled with supply chain disruptions, has slowed the momentum of the global recovery. In East Asia, the unbalanced recovery has continued. China's economy is projected to grow by 8.5% in 2021, faster than expected. Indonesia and the Philippines are expected to grow above 5% this year, and most other economies would rebound more slowly. Going forward, we do see the recovery trend continuing into 2022, partly because people are learning to live with the virus. We also assume a steady progress in vaccination and progressive revival of businesses as the economy reopens. Of course, there are many downside risks to the global recovery process. We should admit that the global trajectory of the pandemic will remain basically unpredictable. Even in countries with high vaccination rates, infections have continued to spread, although with reduced severity of illness, hospitalization, and mortality. And variants of concerns, breakthrough cases, and waning vaccine efficacy could remain key sources of uncertainty and risk in the next 2 years to come. At this juncture, The revival of private investment and businesses will be critical to bolster the recovery. This will, however, not be easy because many of the small firms have lost valuable intangible assets such as talent, know-how, employee skills, and management skills during the past year and a half. Other firms will have to repair their balance sheets before being able to borrow and invest again. These are specific scars of the pandemic that active labor market policies and business support to businesses could remedy. Addressing the challenges faced by the poor and the vulnerable, as well as narrowing the educational disparities, are the other two key challenges that Malaysia, but also many other countries face. In the short term, it is essential that policy measures are geared toward continuous support to the poor, ensuring greater inclusivity with social insurance, and mitigating further learning losses. Over the long term, Malaysia could take steps to reform its social protection system, making it more robust and better targeted. Finally, as the country transitions from short-term responses to longer-term recovery and structural reforms, judicious fiscal management would be essential. Pandemic-related spending has further constrained Malaysia's already limited fiscal space. In the absence of reforms, government revenue is expected to remain on a downward trend, and at the same time, expenditures are expected to increase. This would increase fiscal risk. Therefore, planned effort to rebuild fiscal buffers should be accelerated. It is indeed critical for the government to collect more and spend better. The Malaysian government announced the 12th Malaysia Plan in October. The plan aims to achieve a prosperous, inclusive, and sustainable Malaysia in line with the shared prosperity vision. As a close partner, the World Bank stands with the Malaysian people as they pursue the reforms for a more inclusive and sustainable growth as outlined in the plan. I wish everyone a good and insightful session ahead, and salam sejahtera. Thank you very much and terima kasih. And now, I would like to take this opportunity to invite YB Dato Sri Mustafa bin Muhammad, Minister in the Prime Minister's Department, for his opening remarks.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, selamat pagi, good morning. Dr. Ndiami Diop, World Bank Country Director for Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines and Thailand. Datuk Saiful Anwar, Director General of the Economic Planning Unit, Prime Minister's Department. Dr. Yasuhiko Matsuda, Country Manager for World Bank Malaysia Office. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor for me to be here today to launch the 25th edition of the Malaysia Economic Monitor. I would like to commend the World Bank for never failing to regularly publish the Malaysian Economic Monitor (MAM) every 6 months since 2009. The MAM provides useful feedback on recent economic developments in Malaysia, contributing towards constructive debate and discussion on the Malaysian economy. The theme of this latest edition, Staying Afloat, is consistent with the work the government has been doing in the past 21 months to protect lives and livelihoods during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, after living under the cloud of the COVID-19 pandemic over the past 2 years, the country is now starting to see the sun. This is largely to two factors. Firstly, our country's high vaccination rates, in which about 98% of adults have now been fully vaccinated. And secondly, the substantial fiscal support we are given to the people and businesses, spending 8 stimulus packages, as well as measures introduced in both Budget 2021 and 2022. This has helped to contain the number of deaths and infections in this country, as well as reduce unemployment, keep many businesses, both big and small, afloat, and protect vulnerable groups. Ladies and gentlemen, fiscal policy has been expansionary in the past 2 years and will continue to be so in order to ensure the well-being of Keluarga Malaysia. In line with the 12th Malaysia Plan, the initiatives under Budget 22 are focused on speeding up recovery, strengthening economic resilience, and accelerating reforms. Today, I would like to share my thoughts on 3 subjects. Firstly, is our new approach to eradicate hardcore poverty. Secondly, is the need to improve the quality of human capital and increase income levels of Malaysian households. And thirdly, is our promotion of inclusivity and whole of society approach in the formulation and implementation of policies. Ladies and gentlemen, while GDP growth is expected to be between 3 and 4% this year, the further reopening of economic and social sectors, as well as stronger external demand from major trading partners, is expected to see GDP growth between 5.5 to 6.5% next year. This is in line with the World Bank's projection in this MEM of 5.8% growth in 2022. As much as the government's short-term policies are important to drive our economic recovery in 2022, it is equally critical that we put in place medium and longer-term institutional reforms to strengthen our resilience. Certainly, one of the hardest hit groups during the pandemic has been vulnerable households. These include, firstly, those in lower-income groups, most of whom are in the MSME sector. Secondly, those who have lost their jobs. Thirdly, those with few or no assets or savings to fall back on. And fourthly, informal workers who are not adequately covered by social safety nets. Ladies and gentlemen, the government is committed to eliminate hardcore poverty by the year 2025. For this purpose, a poverty unit under the Economic Planning Unit has been set up to coordinate policy matters on poverty alleviation at the national level. This unit, together with the Implementation Coordination Unit ICU, will coordinate strategies and programs to sustainably raise the incomes of the hardcore poor. In this regard, we acknowledge the inputs by our colleagues from the World Bank team here and globally in sharing best practices in poverty alleviation. I take note of the World Bank's recent report on multidimensional poverty MPI in Malaysia, entitled Improving Measurement and Policies in the 2020s. The Malaysian MPI, first introduced in the 11th Malaysia Plan, consists of 4 dimensions, namely health, education, living standards, and income. In making our measurement of MPI more inclusive, the government will take into account the World Bank's suggestion of setting more ambitious income and non-income poverty indicators. Ladies and gentlemen, about 5 months ago, in July, I set up a roundtable discussion group called the Poverty Circle, which brings together the government, civil society organizations, CSOs, corporate bodies, academicians, and experts to share the experiences in dealing with poverty. 6 Poverty Circle sessions have since been conducted, and some of the inputs have contributed to the formulation of strategies to eradicate hardcore poverty. In March next year, we are going to be working hand in hand with state governments, civil society organizations, and the private sector in implementing hardcore poverty eradication programs in the poorest localities of Malaysia. We'll adopt a holistic and targeted approach to eradicate hardcore poverty in about 50 localities throughout Malaysia. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for poverty eradication. Our strategies will be tailor-made based on unique features of each locality. Ladies and gentlemen, Malaysia aspires to be a high-income nation by the year 2025. According to World Bank's projections, Malaysia is expected to exceed the threshold that defines a high-income economy at some point between 2024 to 2028. One issue we have to address in order to achieve high-income status is low wages. A Department of Statistics DOSM survey on wages and salaries in July 2021 shows that the percentage of workers in our country earning less than 3,000 ringgit is now at about 65%. There was also a DOSM study on university graduates in July 2021, showing a worrying trend of declining numbers of graduates working in the skilled category. The skilled category refers to professional and managerial positions. About 31% of graduates are still working in semi-skilled and low-skilled categories. In the 12th plan, our target is to improve the share of compensation of employees CE to GDP from 37.2% to about 40%. If we want to achieve this target, we need more and more Malaysians working in the skilled category. CE refers to the total gross wages paid by employers to employees as a percentage of our GDP. 2 important strategies to achieve our goal of 40% CE is by firstly enhancing Malaysia's position as a quality investment destination, and secondly improving the marketability of our TVET graduates to meet the demands of industry. Ladies and gentlemen, as a country, we must be honest with where we are and where we must improve. We must critically examine our strengths and shortcomings. As outlined in the 12th Malaysia Plan, we have ambitious targets, including eradicating hardcore poverty, increasing income levels, and making Malaysia an investment-friendly nation. We have 4 years to achieve these targets. We take note of the 6 key reform areas suggested by the World Bank in the Aiming High report. These include revitalizing long-term growth, boosting competitiveness, creating jobs, modernizing institutions, promoting inclusion, and financing shared prosperity. The government will continue to work closely with the World Bank and indeed other international organizations, as well as the private sector and civil society organizations in improving the lives of every Malaysian. The government is always striving to be more inclusive in our approach to policy making, in line with the whole of society framework of the 12 Malaysia Plan. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I would like to thank the World Bank team, led by Dr. Apurva Sanghi, lead economist for the World Bank office in Malaysia, for the preparation of this report. I would also like to thank all the relevant ministries and agencies for their cooperation and inputs in assisting the World Bank for this report. I look forward to continuing the close collaboration the Economic Planning Unit has had with the World Bank over the years. On that note, it gives me great pleasure to launch the Malaysia Economic Monitor December 2021 edition, Staying Afloat. Thank you and all the best. Sekian, terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, YB Minister, for those insightful remarks. Our first presentation this morning is by Dr. Apurva Sanghi, lead economist at the World Bank Group. Apurva's presentation will look at Malaysia's macroeconomic development and outlook ahead. The floor is yours, Apurva.
Good morning. I'm Apurva Sanghi, the World Bank lead economist for Malaysia. On behalf of an incredible team of economists and sectoral experts who have prepared this report, it is indeed a pleasure for me to present part 1 of the 25th edition of the Malaysia Economic Monitor. My colleague, Dr. Ririn Punamasari, will present part 2, which focuses on vulnerable households. I will focus on recent economic developments and our outlook for the Malaysian economy. So a few words on a global and regional view. Now, COVID has shown that we may all be in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. Some are in yachts, others are clinging to driftwood. We estimate that COVID has pushed more people into extreme poverty, with around 100 million more people around the world living on less than $1.90 a day since the crisis began. The poorest 40% are at risk of losing a decade, 10 years of development. Now, the global economic recovery began earlier this year, but has since slowed down. This is because of the resurgence of the pandemic and lingering supply chain disruptions. A reminder once again that the pandemic remains in charge, with the world now facing the new and unknown risk of the rapidly spreading Omicron variant. Coming to the East Asia and Pacific region, economic activity strengthened in the region but with wide variation across countries, with China, Malaysia's largest trading partner, gaining the most strength. Now, what has happened in Malaysia this year? I'm going to talk briefly about what happened to output, jobs and inflation, and then fiscal policy. Now, this year has been somewhat of a roller coaster. So on output, the first quarter of 2021 saw a growth contraction. The second quarter experienced a rather strong expansion, 16%, whereas the third quarter contracted by 4.5%. Now, the third quarter contraction is not surprising per se, as it was around that time that Malaysia experienced some of the most stringent pandemic-related restrictions. Indeed, output declined across all economic sectors in the third quarter. Construction was the most severely affected, manufacturing the least, given continued strong external demand for Malaysia's manufactured goods and commodity exports. In fact, Malaysia's exports outpaced the world and the rest of the region, particularly in electronics and electrical equipment, E&E. In our report, we discuss in a bit more detail how Malaysia has been a major innovator in the E&E industry in the region. However, it now lacks China, and countries like Vietnam are soon catching up. So more industry-relevant R&D is likely to strengthen Malaysia's competitiveness in this segment. Now, moving on to jobs, the unemployment rate peaked in June at 5.3% and has come down to 4.5%. Wage subsidies, in part, worked in preventing mass unemployment. However, underemployment rates still remain elevated. This reflects the continued underutilization of Malaysia's labor force, but it also underscores labor market distortions and structural issues such as skills mismatches, the rise of the informal and gig economy, and the lack of affordable childcare, which all undercut the creation of stable jobs. Moving on to inflation, there's good news and not so good news. The good news is that headline inflation at 2.2% in the third quarter remains low. It's also low compared to other countries, and partly due to a smaller base effect from fuel prices. Wage and food subsidies have helped contain inflation in Malaysia. The current monetary policy stance thus remains accommodative. The not so good news is that inflationary pressures have been rising recently, given a marked surge in the prices of some food items such as poultry and vegetables. These increases are due to supply shortages from adverse weather conditions and shortage of foreign labor. Now, government plans to set up temporary markets which would offer certain food items below market price may help in the short term. But medium-term measures are needed to reduce the impact of climatic volatility on agriculture and diversify food supply beyond paddy. Now, moving to fiscal policy. On the fiscal side, fiscal policy in Malaysia has been rightly counter-cyclical, given the need for the government to spend more because of the pandemic. Now, the total value of all economic stimulus packages this year in 2021 was about 15% of GDP, with a direct fiscal injection of 1.7% of GDP. So the fiscal deficit is now expected to widen to 6.5% in 2021. Now, to accommodate higher spending, the debt limit was subsequently raised from 60 to 65% of GDP. Now, this move was both needed and necessary. But increasing debt in the absence of higher revenues and rigid expenditures also means paying more to service it. Consequently, debt service charges have breached the self-imposed limit of 15% of revenue and expected to rise to 17.4% and 18.4% in the next 2 years. Now, taking into account other fixed expenditure commitments, such as on pensions and emoluments, more than 60 sen of each ringgit raised in revenue now goes towards meeting such fixed expenditures. So this underscores the narrowing of Malaysia's fiscal space, which means that a higher share of revenue is channeled for servicing debt rather than for other priority needs such as social spending. Moreover, the announcement of Budget 2022, the most expansionary budget to date, indicates fiscal space will remain constrained. Now, new sets of tax measures were announced, such as the one-off windfall tax, tax on sweetened beverages, removal of tax exemptions on foreign income. However, the overall impact is expected to remain small, and the government is indeed working towards a more comprehensive revenue-raising strategy. And in this report, we touch upon the pros and cons of consumption taxes such as a GST or a VAT, which can help rebuild fiscal buffers. But I have to say that raising more money is one half of the coin. The other half is ensuring spending it efficiently, effectively, and transparently. In that context, the final point on fiscal policy I'd like to emphasize is the urgency and timeliness of the proposed Fiscal Responsibility Act, the FRA, in 2022. Such an act, if properly designed and implemented, should indeed help establish a path for medium-term fiscal consolidation and also help deepen public trust in government spending. Now, what lies ahead for Malaysia? Well, Malaysia has had a difficult year and has more than its share of downside risks on the horizon. On the external front, downside risks include the uncertainty that the new and highly transmissible Omicron variant brings, longer than anticipated global supply chain disruptions, and the cooling down of China's economy or resumption in US-China trade tensions that could directly affect Malaysia's external demand. On the domestic front, closer to home, is the unknown risk that the Omicron variant may pose to the stability of Malaysia's health system. and of course, the increased vulnerability of affected households and businesses that may constrain recovery and growth. So, my colleague, Dr. Ririn, will discuss our latest findings on the pandemic's impact on Malaysian households. But it is worth keeping in mind some silver linings. First is Malaysia's incredible success in achieving an over 97% adult vaccination rate. And not only that, now moving fast in the 12 to 17-year-old category. This and other public health measures are enabling the economy to reopen further, releasing pent-up demand in private consumption, and with it, a gradual return of private investment. On this basis, and subject to all the caveats that come with economic forecasting, and especially in times like this, we project the economy to grow at 3.3% this year in 2021, 5.8% next year in 2022, and 4.5% in 2023. Second, on the back of continued progress in national digital infrastructure investments, the pandemic has spurred digitalization in Malaysia. The challenge, however, will be how to make digitalization not only stick, but also to ensure that both firms, notably SMEs, and individuals, notably disadvantaged students, do not get left behind. Third, Malaysia has done rather well in terms of taking advantage of the improving external environment this year. But the future of trade will depend not just on trade in E&E and rubber gloves, but equally importantly in trade and services. Indeed, the pandemic has created new opportunities for trade and services, and new value chains in health, education, businesses are emerging, and Malaysia can better position itself for these value chains. So, where does this leave us? I'd like to say three things. First, it is essential to avoid any premature unwinding of assistance measures until the economy recovery is firmly underway and until the negative output gap is overcome. In that context, strengthening Malaysia's health system remains vitally important, as does making all efforts to ensure the success of the booster vaccine program. Second, targeted social spending should remain in place in the near term to protect those affected. At the same time, steps should be taken to improve targeting and to reach out to those who have been excluded. And my colleague Ririn will talk more about this. And third, over the long term, is addressing the shrinking fiscal space. And in that context, the importance of a well-designed Fiscal Responsibility Act and revenue mobilization measures would be key. So in closing, let me just say that as we emerge from this year-long roller coaster ride, a strengthened focus on policy options to help Malaysians stay afloat, and the gradual easing of fiscal pressures will help to put the economy on track, uphold the vulnerable, and prepare Malaysia for greater recovery prospects come 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Apurva, for your informative presentation. Let's now zoom into the special focus of this report and invite Dr. Ririn Salwa Purnamasari, Senior Economist at the World Bank Group, to present her findings on the impact of this pandemic on Malaysian households. Ririn, the floor is yours.
Terima kasih Zainab. Selamat pagi, very good morning everyone. Today I will present special topic of part 2 of the 25th editions of Malaysia Economic Monitor, which focuses on how the poor and vulnerable Malaysian households have fared in the COVID-19 crisis and to stay afloat as economic recovery gradually began. The discussions is mainly based on findings from 2 rounds of the World Bank High Frequency Phone Survey, we call it HIFI, which took place in May-June and October-November 2021. Employment and income are key channels through which COVID-related economic shocks manifest in household livelihood. The HIFI survey confirms that employment has fluctuated over the course of the pandemic. Low income, less educated, and particularly informally employed workers turn out to be more prone to loss of employment and reductions in income. These economic disruptions in turn have broader, non-economic consequences on households, including food insecurity, learning gaps, and harmful coping mechanisms which pose further risk widening existing socio-economic inequality in the future. On the positive note, recent data show recovery across the board, although the progress is uneven. Given the rapidly evolving pandemic, policymakers continue to need new real-time data to inform policymaking processes. It is therefore crucial to monitor the welfare of households during the pandemic and analyze the effectiveness of current measures to facilitate greater evidence-based decision-making for an inclusive and resilient recovery for Malaysia. As my colleague Apurva presented earlier, the pandemic has weakened labor markets. In fact, as the Hi-Fi shows, there was churn in and out of employment during the pandemic, with 26% adult workers changing their employment status between pre-pandemic and mid-June 2021. Over 1 year into the pandemic, most who worked pre-pandemic were able to continue working, but more than 1/3 of them with reduced income. Meanwhile, by June, there were still 1/4 of workers who stopped working. Interestingly, there were also new entrants to labor market. New entrants were more likely to have entered the informal workforce, suggesting flexibility and low barriers to entry into the informal labor markets. Here, informally employed workers is defined as workers who do not receive contributions to either the Employees Provident Fund or EPF or Social Security Organization SOCSO from their current employers. While informal jobs provide the means to earn an income, which hence serve as shock absorbers during economic downturns, these jobs do not provide adequate protections. The Hi-Fi survey found that informally employed workers were more likely to experience a reduction in income. Among the Malaysians' new entrants, slightly more women enter the informal workforce than men. Despite the impacts of the pandemic on employment appear to be widespread, low-income and less educated groups in Malaysia have experienced relatively greater difficulties. Low-income earners experience more significant work stoppage. More than 40% of individuals earning less than 2,000 ringgit Malaysia had work interruption since the upside of the pandemic, which means about 2-4 times higher than that from higher income groups. Work stoppage is also higher among youth and those with secondary educations and lower, but no difference between female and male workers. The good news is gradual recovery is underway and across the board. Half of the people who had stopped working by around June 2021 had returned to work by November 2021. Also, 1/4 of workers no longer reported experiencing income losses. However, progress is unequal. The adverse impact of the pandemic on employment and income continued to linger among lower income households and informally employed workers. To cope with these economic shocks, majority households withdrew their personal saving. Having limited resources, they were also more likely to rely on harmful financial coping strategies such as reductions in consumptions and asset sales that may reduce household productive potentials in the future. Consequently, these coping strategies have resulted in increases to the level of financial vulnerability of low-income households. More than 40% of households that earn 2,000 ringgit Malaysia or less reported that they had only 3 months or less of savings by November 2021. As a result, they are more likely to be worried about their household finances in the near future. At the same time, a higher prevalence of food insecurity is reported by informally employed workers among low-income households even after receiving government assistance. In response to the pandemic, the government broadened the coverage of its social assistance programs, increasing the income eligibility threshold of its flexi cash transfers programs and establishing mechanisms to deliver the benefits swiftly. The government also implemented measures to protect informally employed workers particularly gig workers. However, as the Hi-Fi findings show, despite these generous and progressive response programs the government disbursed, 2/3 of households earning 2,000 ringgit Malaysia or below reported that they were unable or only partially able to cover their monthly basic needs, even after taking into account all of the government assistance they might receive. At the same time, nearly 1 in 3 households from this income group reported had not received any government assistance since June 2021. All of these findings indicate insufficient coverage and benefit adequacy of current programs. Findings from the Hi-Fi that suggest more severe impact faced by the poor and informally employed workers underscores pre-existing gaps in the social protection systems. Even prior to the pandemic, social assistance in Malaysia only had modest impacts on poverty and inequality compared to other upper middle income countries and Southeast Asian peers. Meanwhile, about 1/3 of private sector workers were uncovered by any form of social insurance. As I earlier mentioned, the adverse impact of the pandemic on households extend beyond just economic consequences. For example, on the education front. However, even prior to the pandemic, issues related to disparities in outcomes in the Malaysian education system were already present. There were significant learning gaps between students from socio-economically advantaged and disadvantaged households, with these gaps widening over time. For instance, according to PISA 2009, socio-economically advantaged students in Malaysia outperformed their disadvantaged peers in reading by 53 points. By 2018, this gap had widened to 89 points, meaning that advantaged students' performance improved while disadvantaged students' performance declined over this period. On a more positive note, there is still hope for disadvantaged students to mitigate the losses as they were academically resilient despite their socio-economic circumstances. The challenge now is that pandemic might further widen the learning gaps among children. As of October 2021, Malaysia's pandemic response had resulted in 42 weeks of school closures, one of the longest periods in the region. A simulation study to assess the impact of pandemic-related school closures estimate up to 1.3 years of additional learning losses for Malaysian students. This could translate into average annual earning losses up to more than $2,000 per student under pessimistic scenario. This, together with the economic difficulties caused by the pandemic, has heightened the risk of learning loss and dropout among students, particularly among those from disadvantaged socio-economic households. As the Hi-Fi survey indicated, during the school closures period, children from low-income households were less likely to continue with at-home learning activities. Interestingly, reasons for not engaging in at-home learning have changed from initially due to having no devices and unstable connections to more recently because of lack interest or adult supervisions. Given these constraints, children from lower income households were more likely to have been unable or have participated only to a limited degree to online learning. Although there had been an increase in online learning participations in the past few months, children from the lower income households remain less likely to engage in online learning activities than those in wealthier households. These results show that while there are multiple long-term drivers, the pandemic is likely to exacerbate pre-existing Malaysia educational gaps and potentially widen socioeconomic inequality in the longer term. Findings from Hi-Fi highlight that the pandemic hit and set back progress in many aspects of household socioeconomic conditions. There are a wide range of unequal impacts of the pandemic on households, with the worst impacts are afflicting those who were already disadvantaged and vulnerable before the pandemic. Pushing existing inequalities to the forefront, risking long-term negative economic and social impacts in the future. Malaysia's dreams to become a high-income nation by 2028 might not be realized under these circumstances. To ensure Malaysia fulfill its growth potential, it is a very critical and opportune time for the country to address pre-existing fault lines as well as newly emerged scars from the crisis. For that, in the near term, policy measures should be geared toward maintaining financial support for the poor and vulnerable and establishing a more inclusive and social insurance framework. Specifically, this includes first, continuing the existing pandemic relief cash transfers to target groups at least for the next 6 months as the economy is expected to rebound. Second, the government could also consider targeted wage subsidies for workers who traditionally face structural barriers in the labor market, particularly youth and women. And third, pilot and evaluate measures to strengthen and extend the social insurance systems to provide better coverage for informally employed workers. Within Malaysia's education space, measures are required to improve learning processes, especially for socioeconomically disadvantaged children. As a crucial first step, the government could conduct an assessment of the pandemic-related learning losses to make necessary adjustment to the existing curriculum to mitigate these losses. It is also essential to create remedial interventions that enable disadvantaged students to receive more support through face-to-face instructions and hybrid learning models. Finally, teachers, schools, and district offices should be provided with support to implement strategies to help students to achieve socio-emotional well-being and to cope with learning difficulties. As discussed earlier, the pandemic has exposed a number of gaps and limitations in the ability of Malaysia's existing social safety net systems to fully protect poor and vulnerable households in a crisis. Similarly, the pandemic has also cast a clearer light on disparities and quality issues in the educational systems. Therefore, over the medium to long term, policymakers should seize the opportunity to implement measures to make improvements in these areas, not just as a response to the pandemic, but to ensure the achievement of more equitable and sustainable growth more generally. A number of priorities in the social safety net system could include improving targeting and adequacy of cash transfers to ensure the inclusion of the poorer and vulnerable groups, consolidating and rationalizing a range of existing programs to develop a modern, integrated, efficient, and shock-responsive social assistance system. In relation to fiscal policy, over time, the Malaysian government may need to increase its expenditures on social assistance to ensure a robust social protection systems and to promote equitable outcomes. Also, extending social insurance coverage to a greater range of informally employed workers with the establishment of a system that distributes benefits according to the workers' needs and abilities. Lastly, strengthening active labor market policies to increase their responsiveness to economic shocks. On education front, the priority should be to improve resilience of the education systems by improving the accessibility and quality of digital learning, including ensuring the adequacy of ICT infrastructures and skills needed. Further, the government could strive to improve the provisions of training and support to teachers and principals to enable them to be more responsive and adaptive to future shocks. With this, we reach the end of the presentations. On behalf of my colleagues who have been involved in the productions this editions of Malaysia Economic Monitoring, we thank all of you for your time and interest. And please stay tuned for the final discussion. Terima kasih, and back to you, Zainab.
Thank you, Ririn, for sharing that illuminating presentation. So far, we have seen the impact caused by the pandemic and the outlook ahead for the country's economy. So how will Malaysian households, particularly lower income and vulnerable households, stay afloat? We are honored to welcome an esteemed panel of speakers today discussing this exact point. First, Professor Dr. Madeline Burma, Honorary Professor at the University of Malaysia Sarawak, Associate Professor Dr. Muhammad Yusuf Sa'ari, Chief Economist at the EIS UPM CS Center for Future Labour Market Studies under SOCSO, Kelvin Tan, co-founder and CEO of Project ID, a student development and empowerment organization, and YB Nurul Izzah Anwar, Member of Parliament for Pematang Pau. Our panel today will be moderated by Dr. Amanina Abdul Rahman, an economist in the Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice at the World Bank Group. Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zainab, for the introduction, and thank you all for tuning in for the panel discussion. I am excited to hear our panelists' thoughts on supporting vulnerable households, and so without further delay, let's go straight into it. If I could start with Prof. Madeline. The Malaysia Economic Monitor focuses on the economic vulnerabilities of low-income households and informally employed workers, as well as the challenges faced by students during the pandemic. Even prior to the pandemic, an increasing number of Malaysians in both low and middle-income groups had struggled to make ends meet, a situation that has only worsened. Prof. Madeline, in your view, what are some of the measures that can be taken to address these vulnerabilities in the process of economic recovery that is inclusive and resilient?
Amanina, thank you very much for your introduction. And I would like to thank my World Bank for inviting me to share my thoughts. Okay, let me just focus on one thing first. Given my background, much of my work has been in rural areas of Sabah and Sarawak. So today I will tend to focus my discussion to these two states. Focus. Nina, you were asking me like, what are the things that we should do? First, I would like to highlight the fact that if you look at, I had a chance to listen to the presentation just now. When we talk about vulnerable groups, a lot of it is focusing on those with income or those who are working in the informal sector. Now, there is one aspect that I think that has not been discussed, and this there are two now. Actually, one is the those from the what do you call the indigenous communities, the orang asal. Those who are living in the rural areas, or rather in Sabah and Sarawak, even to the extent of living in the interior. So I think this report, I cannot imagine making a phone call to them. So I assume they are the ones who are being left out. Okay. So number one, as you can see, even in terms of being included in this discussion in the report, we can see that there is another layer that I think we have kind of missed. Okay, that's number one. Let me just start by saying that. And then number two, the focus has always been on income. The way I look at it and the way we address issues has always been very income centric. So if you ask me, what or rather how can we address the pandemic? This is a $1 million question. The first thing that I would like to focus on is empowerment. Because the way we in the past, it has always been, as I said, it is very top down. It is very government centric, whereby it is always the government knows it all. But I think this has changed in the last few years. But nevertheless, if you look at the kind of approach, it has always been government providing assistance. So I would like to turn that a bit around so that to a certain extent, we can include those who had been, excluded, really excluded. Number one, for example, the indigenous communities in Sabah and Sarawak, and even in Semenanjung, for those like, for example, the Batik, the Orang Asli. Yeah, so some of them were undocumented. Okay, they are without documents, like the ones in Sabah. The ones that we studied, the Palau, the Sea Gypsies, they are without documents. Now, how are we going to protect them? How are they going to be part and parcel of the recovery? Now, that's number one. Number two, in terms of the kind of approach, when we talk about empowerment, I'm talking here not just only income. When we talk about empowerment, I would like to talk about voice, power, and access. Now, let me just focus on the undocumented communities, right? In Malaysia, the way we address, or rather poverty alleviation, is always targeted, And that means you have to be registered. One has to be in the system. So if you are not in the system, you will definitely will not have access to most of the support. So in other words, you need to have my card. You need to have identity. You need to be part and parcel of the system. You need to know who's who. You need to know almost all the things, the way the system works. So number one, how first, I think the most important thing is how can we include as many as possible Malaysians, or I put in inverted comma, non-Malaysians. They are Malaysians, like they are Sarawakians, but they do not have identity cards in the system, so that there will be part of the targeted approach. So without, in the absence of them being in the system, they will not be able to get the support. That's number one. So to me, targeting, that's very, very important. I think Tokpa just now did mention they are going out in, I think, the next few months, they are going out to do targeted approach. But targeted approach means you have to be in the system. So I cannot imagine a Penan or a Pelau going into the system. So we need to go into this exercise of, to avoid this, what we call the error of omission. Giving support to those who don't need and not giving support to those who need. So this is what we call the error of omission. So that's number one. Yeah? Number two is about empowerment. Yeah? So when I talk about empowerment, I'm looking at 5 areas. Number one, how can we increase physical access? We can hear during this pandemic how many of our OKUs, our PWDs, people from the rural, the interior, have difficulties in terms of accessing because of remoteness, because they do not have access. So that is number one, physical access. Number two, psychological access. I am talking about psychology here. That is about confidence. Many of our communities lost their confidence due to loss of income, loss of jobs, loss of a lot of things. And in fact, during the what do you call the banjir, the recent banjir, we see how many of us were very, very disappointed with the system. Many of them do not feel that they are part of the system anymore because they have been denied of what they feel is their rights. Okay, that is psychological access. Number 3 is very, very important. That is based on my work in rural areas. Relational access. Dalam bahasa Melayu, hubungan. Access hubungan. Yeah? The relationship to one another. Now we have seen the breaking down. The breaking down of our social network in the rural areas. Many of the children have left. They have left the rural, they have left the long houses. They went to the cities. When they come back, there's nobody at all, in the rural areas that they can relate to, that they can support. Or alternatively, relational access is also related to how the communities relate to their YBs. Dr. Nuriza, YB Nuriza is here. I'm sure she's very aware of that. The YBs, and above all, their relationship with their community leaders, and also with the government agencies or NGOs. So this has to be improved. The fourth is, I think this is another equally important one, what we call procedural access. How to make procedures less complicated. Even people like me have difficulties in accessing all the lengthy procedures in trying to assess support. The time, for example, I give you a very simple example. In order to go to an ATM in rural Sarawak, they have to get, and during the MCO, at the height of the MCO, they need to get, the what do you call it, from the police station to cross daerah, districts. So in order for them to go there, it takes them 3 to 4 hours to go and get the what do you call, the clearance from the police. And from there, another 3 to 4 hours to go to the nearest bank or to the nearest ATM machine. And why can't we make those kind of procedures, that is not one size fit all? It works for people in the urban areas. It works for people probably in the suburban areas or even rural, but not to those in the interior. So these are what I call procedures, procedures that are really, preventing or inhibiting access to, access to government support and even NGO support. And finally, I would like to also relate to what we call cultural access. I remember in Sohakam, because I'm working with Sohakam, one of my colleagues, even we have difficulty in trying to persuade our orang asli to accept the vaccination. Similarly, in rural Sarawak, most of the messages or rather information regarding COVID, for example, or even government support are in the major languages. Okay, in the case of Sarawak, it is either in Malay, English, Chinese, or Iban. But in Sarawak, we have more than 40 sub-ethnic groups. And even if there are some information, many of this information are either through TV or through the internet. And these people do not have, the Penans, the Punan, the Beketan, the Saban, the Ukit, who live in the interior, have very limited access. So in my opinion, the two most important thing is, one is, of course, as I mentioned just now, empowerment, and the other one is, of course, to increase or rather increase the capacity of the communities, and this is through registration of our especially those who are undocumented, or the what we call sometimes call as in Sabah, many of them are stateless. So thank you very much.
Terima kasih Prof. Madeline kerana membawa perhatian kami kepada these important vulnerable groups that may have been uncaptured by the data, as well as the various types and reasons for the lack of access to the formal social protection system, which are really important for us to think about when we talk about strengthening the system. So thank you again for that. If I could move now to YB Nurul Izzah. Congratulations on the recent launch of the Permatan Pau Multidimensional Poverty Index Report 2021, which, like the Hi-Fi, exposes the economic vulnerabilities of Malaysians. What are some of the main economic vulnerabilities that you have found in your constituency, and how can they be addressed?
Thank you so much, Dr. Amanina. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam hormat. I think, I was very encouraged when the Hi-Fi survey was conducted, because it's not only relevant in terms of the experiences by Malaysia, but also many other countries. So you look at COVID and it really exposes the level of deprivation, which is multidimensional, as eloquently highlighted by Prof. Dato' Manlin just now, because I think it's something that people take for granted, and the way we look at things or the way we measure poverty has to change. And one of this was the driving reason as to why we decided, together with the leadership of Professor Dr. Fatimah Kari, to do this study at the height of COVID, which is between April to August this year. So we find that almost 36% of our respondents are unemployed. 33% are self-employed, while the remaining 31% are the only ones who are formally employed. So these are, what Prof sebut tadi, in terms of the ones that are not recognized by the system. And even though they belong within the B40 category, and of the 59 formally employed individuals, only 76% reported they were covered by SOCSO or EPF. So beyond just economic vulnerabilities, we highlighted and utilized 9 conventional dimensions, and 3 of those from the 9 was related to COVID-19. Conventional, I'm sure, something like in terms of housing, the highest deprivation rate at 0.340, which is going to be worsened with the flooding, in terms of sanitation, water supply, health, and electricity. Now, the 3 COVID-related indicators were also, recorded relatively high deprivation rates. Comfort within the home at 0.274, the indicator for loss of employment and incomes due to the movement control order at 0.194, and finally, the deprivation rate relating to remote teaching and learning, PDPR, which is the highest figure of all at 0.499. Again, it's linked to the high five findings. You talk about children, how much losses they are suffering because of online learning. So even those who had online learning, you can't assume it's going to be absorbing the maximum ability as they did in normal class hours. The average income of our base households, is about 2,131 ringgit 85 cents per month, compared to single mother households. That stands at 1,451 ringgit 71 cents, per month. And when I give this to the Ministry of Finance, because I think it's important for them to also look, even though it's only representative of B40 in Permatang Pau, but we then should implement an NPI in Sabah, in Sarawak, because it really gives you a more a localized and geographically suited look at the different types of deprivation, and that it helps policymakers and governments to plug in those needs. So for single mothers, their households are far more deprived, and in terms of, the only exception was health. They must have fed their children well, but the other dimensions related to, access to learning was at 0.419. Loss of employment and income and home comfort recorded a significantly higher deprivation rate compared to normal households. So I think gender-based budgeting factors in and looms as a really crucial ingredient, because if you don't factor that in, you're going to cause intergenerational trauma to repeat itself in a very vicious cycle. So that would be my answer. Thank you for the time, Anina. Yeah.
Thank you very much, YB, for sharing the findings of the Permatang Pau MPI, as well as highlighting the importance of having these types of indicators also in other parts of Malaysia.
Can I just add
one
one
of
more
the things-
point, if it's okay?
Of course.
So, because it's very linked to the poverty line income, because our government has not utilized the most recent one based on 2019's findings. We are still using the basket, the food basket kind of income level. So you're talking about, after the pandemic, so many people missing out on the cash disbursements. And I think that's one. And second, even though Dr. Sri Mustafa Muhammad has agreed to utilize the MPI for future government measurement, I think they cannot ignore the fact that you still need to look at the flood-stricken households, because flood-stricken households will be far more vulnerable, and their baseline will be different versus those who perhaps, alhamdulillah, have escaped for now the disastrous natural disaster, and of course the terribly managed flood mitigation works. Over to you, Dr. Amanina.
No, thank you very much, YB. I think that's a very important point, that the disbursement of social assistance has to be based on an updated poverty line, as well as the important need for shock responsive social protection systems, including that related to climate shocks. And we will go into that a little bit later. But for now, to touch on a slightly different point, you also talked a little bit about self-employed persons in Permatang Pau and how they have struggled. And so if I can dig into this point a little bit deeper with Prof. Yusof, one of the findings of the high five, discussed also by my colleague Ririn earlier, finds that new entrants to the workforce are more likely to be informally employed. At the same time, informally employed workers have been particularly hard hit during the pandemic, being more likely to have experienced a reduction in income, greater food insecurity, and difficulties paying rent. Could you explain to us some of the labour market and income dynamics faced by informally employed workers in this period? Professor Yusof, you might have to unmute your mic.
Maybe he has to unplug the microphone.
Okay, so while Professor Yusuf sorts that out, maybe we can move on to a slightly different topic and then go back to Prof Yusuf once his technical issues have been resolved. And so if I could now speak a little bit about education, Kelvin, the hi-fi shows that other than the lack of effective access to the internet, one of the main reasons for not participating in online learning is due to a lack of interest. Your organization, Project ID, conducted a survey on Malaysian students' online learning experience. Can you shed some light on some of the reasons behind this lack of interest in online learning? And Prof. Yusuf will get back to you a little bit later. Thank you. So Calvin, over to you.
Another
Oh
mute.
no, we now seem to have lost Calvin.
Only the ladies managed to.
Can you hear me?
Yes, so now we can hear Prof. Yusuf. So maybe we can go back to Prof. Yusuf and then back to Calvin. I'm so sorry, Calvin. We have lost you in terms of audio, but we see you on the screen. So Prof. Yusuf, over to you to talk a little bit about the informally employed workers and their income.
We have the similar. I have encountered a similar problem as we tried dry run day. On that day, I have to leave and then re-enter the room. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Madina, dear colleagues, all the panelists here, panelis hebat-hebat mereka ni. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for World Bank and SOCSO for giving opportunity to me to participate in this panel discussion. This is interesting topic to be discussed in this morning. Back to your questions. Okay, if we track labor market data, the participation of workers in the formal jobs started to increase since Q4 2019, when the labor market participation rate was reduced from 69% to 68% in Q1 2020. On the other side of the coin, when the labor force participation rate was reduced, then the number of self-employed reported by DOSM was increased. So this is a signal that more people recently participating in the informal jobs. And the trend of labor force participation rate and self-employed are fluctuated, following closely the magnitude of non-pharmaceutical measures, or we call it MCO, movement control order, taken by the government to reduce the spread of COVID-19. At this moment, labor force participation rate is still below the rate before the crisis, I mean the 2019, as a benchmark. Therefore, this, as I mentioned, more people still outside there working in the informal jobs or informal sectors. Actually, Dr. Madina, we had addressed the informality employment in our quarterly report in January this year, if I'm not mistaken. In the report, we had expected the informality of employment tend to increase. We also have addressed the issue in the similar issue in our special bulletin for Independent Day in August this year. What we have observed is that, if you remember, after independent, few years after independent, more people are still working in the informal sectors. When we start develop our nation, less and less people working in the formal sectors. Now, COVID-19 or even few years before the COVID-19, it looks like a cycle. Okay, more people now attempt to work in the informal sectors, like music, or I think the one of the song sang by ABBA, I think, Yesterday Once More. So we come back to the informal sectors. Based on the observations, in addition to economic uncertainties, people resort to the informal employment because of there is a gap between the demand and the supply, especially for graduates. So this is structural issues, because the mismatch or the gap between the demand and the supply for across the skill has been observed in early 20s, but when COVID hit Malaysia, so the gap become larger. And one of the reasons, as I mentioned, people tend to choose informal sectors because financial safety net is important. It's priority for them during the crisis and post-crisis. The quickest available job that can provide income and job is informal sectors. Equally important that as far as economic and social welfare are concerned, living large size of people working in the informal sector may not be progressive for keluarga Malaysia. However, we expect actually more people will return to formal job when the economy start to recover. As a matter of fact, recently the DOSM have released labor market report for October 2021. So in the data show that the labor participation rate increased compared to September. This is something good actually for the labor market, meaning that more people looking for formal job, and this is good. I mean that we hope that the size of informal sector can be further reduced in the future. But equally important also, Dr. Amalina, during the pandemic crisis, gig is the saver for the most of employees or for most of workers outside there. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, people are concerned about safety net and their income for their survival and for livelihood. So jobs for the gig worker is the one that available and provide quickest income and job for the people during the pandemic. But moving forward, we need to bring some of them. If of course we don't want to have the situation where the size of informal sector is larger than in Malaysia. We are not like India. We can understand because their backbone of the economy is informal sectors. We are different than India. We have different structure than the economy of India. So we have to bring back as what we experienced in the past, in particular in the years or 1990s or in the in 1990s, especially during the when Malaysia has been titled as Asian Tiger during that time. But I stop here first because I want to discuss more broader informal sectors when come to the next questions. I reserve that first. Dr. Amrina, over to you.
No, thank you very much, Prof. Yusuf. And I think you highlighted a very important point, which is during this crisis, a lot of people resorted to gig jobs or informal jobs because they didn't have a choice. And in other words, these jobs really was a means to provide them with income. But moving forward, we will need to think a little bit more about how we can bring more people into more protected and productive jobs as well. Right, so if we can now go back to Kelvin, and hopefully your tech issues have been resolved. Kelvin, could you share with us some of the findings from the survey conducted by Product ID on Malaysian students' online learning experience, including some of the reasons behind their lack of interest in online learning?
Hi, Dr. Aminina. Just want to check on the audio. Are we good?
All good.
Perfect. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Great to hear all the insights from the esteemed panel this morning. Just to share light on this national survey that we did, we call it the Student Voice Matter, and the context in which it was developed was that when the pandemic first started, we heard a lot of people, adults, policymakers talking about, how should we cater online learning for our students. But as an organization that is centered on student learning and the student voice, we thought, why not ask our students instead? And that's how we started this national survey, to hear what students want for online learning and their challenges and what are their aspirations. And as educators, what can we then learn from that? And so the gist of it is students want to learn, right? But through this study, we found some factors that led to a decline in motivation. And interestingly, quite consistent to what Dr. Ririn shared earlier, we ran this survey twice, once in 2020 and once in 2021, earlier this year. And in our 2020 study, poor internet connection was rated the highest challenge for online learning. However, when it comes to 2021, poor internet connection sort of dropped a little bit, and lack of self-motivation became the top challenge that our students were telling us. And so when we delve a little bit deeper on the reasons for lack of motivation, there are three reasons as to why our students are telling us this. So number one is a significant decrease in social interaction with their peers and teachers. Because the reality is learning is a social experience. And if you ask even adults today, they are telling us, working online is challenging. I rather work face to face. Not all adults, but a lot of them do say such. And so what makes schooling fun and enjoyable, and I'm sure this is true for many of us, is the interaction that we enjoy with our peers, the camaraderie. And while a lot of our students have compensated with online platforms such as Telegram, Discord, Zoom, even online games, as educators, we are still trying to crack how to incorporate some of these social elements into online learning effectively. Now, the second reason as to why there's a lack of motivation is a poor online learning experience. For our students, they are experiencing poor connectivity. They're experiencing school communities trying to get used to technology, trying to increase their digital literacies, and school communities trying to adapt to teach online effectively. So the gist of it is everyone is trying to figure out how to teach online at the start of the pandemic. And what we observed was that a lot of educators initially leveraged on traditional in-classroom teaching methods, what we were doing in the classroom, and we were just trying to shift it on an online platform, and that's it. But that's not effective because there are certain methods and skill set that you need to be able to teach online effectively. And in the education sphere, we were taking a little bit of time to be able to figure that out. And on top of that, at the start of the pandemic, school schedules were mixed up. We had some schools telling us they were waiting instructions from the ministry. Our students were not having a good experience and causing them to write it off as, online learning isn't interesting, or they're simply exhausted from trying really hard to learn online. And I think the last thing is the interruption from extended and recurring school closures. Students have been in a constant state of uncertainty in the past 18 to 20 months, and that can be very frustrating and very tiring for a child. They're never sure when they're going back to school. They have no certainty around their exams. For even more so from students from underserved backgrounds. This is exacerbated by problems at home, family financial priorities. Putting food on the table becomes more important than learning. And then you also have unconducive learning environments at home when you have multiple siblings in a small confined space trying to learn online at the same time. And all of this is in addition to the existing struggles that we know with connectivity and devices. So the barrier of entry to learn online is quite high for many students. And so it's very easy for us, for a student to write themselves off and say, hey, I am no longer interested to learn. Yeah.
Thank you, Kelvin. Thank you for sharing that. I do think, the whole pandemic has been a lot of adapting for everyone, and our students, or Malaysian students are the same, and they are also trying to figure it out. And after so long, I think the lack of motivation is perhaps understandable. Great, thank you. So if we can then move back to something that YB Nurul Izzah mentioned earlier, which is the current floods that have severely affected the central region of Malaysia, and has really emphasized the need for a social protection system that is shock responsive. Maybe I could start with Prof. Madeline first and then move on to YB. But do any of you have any thoughts on how such a system can look like for Malaysia, or on how else we can support those who have been affected by the flood?
Hi, are you referring to me?
Yes, please, Prof. Madeline, if you can come in.
Hello?
Otherwise, yeah, yes, Prof. Madeline, if you can come in.
Yeah, thank you. Now, are you asking me about the flood system? Is it? I can't really hear the last part of your question. Can you just repeat, Dr.
Sorry.
Amelina?
Sure. I was asking about how our social protection system can be made to be more shock responsive in the event of this current flood, but also
Okay.
future crises. Yeah.
Okay. One thing I think I totally agree with YB Nurul. When we talk about disaster, when we talk about the kind of situation that we are in, a lot of times we will go in hindsight we will say we should have been more prepared. Now the word preparedness is very, very important in this post-COVID post-COVID environment. In fact, in the university we are talking about what we call SHAPE, social. Okay, it's about the knowledge, social, humanities, and arts for what we call post, or rather in a post-COVID environment. You see the important role of humanities, the important role of human interaction, the important roles of what we call is the social structure. You see, all the time we tend to rely on government, or we tend to rely on the formal system. We forget that communities, we forget that societies have their own mechanism. They have their own system to kind of that which they can fall back to. But because in the modern system, many of this what we call the social security, maybe Dr. Shari may not agree with me later, because I still believe that, for example, in the rural communities, among the indigenous people, they do have their own system, which all this while we have not really tapped properly. I take, for example, I'll give you a very simple example. In the rural, or rather among the indigenous communities, or even among the Malays, for that matters, for example, income support system. We have the kutu. I don't know. We call it in economics or development economics. We call it credit rotation system, where you do the rotation. Main kutu, where you collect your money, or people contribute. But that system has not been fully developed. But it is a system that the community understand. The community knows how to do it. But what we do, we come up with a system that is very considered as formal, that is a bit alien to the community. So I remember discussing this with our rural communities. I was asking them, during these difficult times, is there any other way that how can we to ensure that you have cash in hand? Somehow or another, many of them were telling me, maybe, in the past we used to we have our kutu. So I thought, oh wow, why can't we focus on something which is very much akin, or rather something that is familiar to the society? So what I'm trying to say is that, number one, go back to a society, or rather we need to ask, this is a time for us to engage, to involve, to consult, with the communities, how to go about. They know their problems, they know how to solve their problems. Gone are the days when we are, people from the universities, people from the government, things that we know everything. I would like to use the word, I underline here, everything. Those days are gone. We must go back to society. We must work together. So the quadruple helix, the government needs the private sector. The private sector needs the NGOs, and the NGOs need the community. So now, to me, if you ask me, Amelina, if you ask me, how can we solve this problem? The first thing is that let's talk, let's engage, let's work together. So it's no longer like, we have all this consultant. We will invite consultant. We will get researchers to do their research. It will take them another 1 year. Why can't we just really empower the communities? To me, the word, in order for us to address vulnerability, the word empowerment is a very powerful word here, because this is where we will engage and we talk to them. So we need to identify who are the vulnerable people. When we say vulnerable, what do we mean by vulnerable? Do we really know what is vulnerability? So some people talk it is only about income. If you talk to an economist, labor economist, they will talk about employment. If you talk to a social scientist, they will talk about different things. To a religious person, it's a totally different thing. Okay, so we need to engage. So another area that we should look into is, like, for example, what is it in the community? The strength of the community. It is the community that knows. The what we call the ikatan, the things that bind them together. We don't need someone from outside, people from outside, academics, even the politicians. We need to engage the politicians because they are the YBs. So academics, or even like policymakers who comes in with using a touch and go approach. I think we need to reduce that, but we need to get more of in terms of community engagement. Because I work a lot with communities. That's why I believe that the community have their own strength. And the problem with that, like for example, during the COVID, when we implement policies, we thought the policies were good for them, without realizing that, for example, the indigenous community, the moment we impose all those what do you call that, the MCO, what happened is that we deprive them of their source of livelihood. For example, the forest is where their supermarket is. But because of the COVID and because of the movement control order, we said they cannot go, the social distancing and everything. So they do not have access to their supermarket. That is the forest, the rivers. So I think it is high time that we listen to all, meaning to say, all the different stages. Because a lot of times when we do engagement, engagement, even the telephone calls, but I don't blame you people, because so this is where we need to leverage on data. This is when I talk about data here, I like what our last speaker was saying, that when the project ID, he was talking about when they were doing phone calls. There is this famous I was doing an engagement, or rather online discussion, with the penans in the rural areas. They were talking about schools and assessing. So they said wire ada, Wi-Fi tiada. So I mean, we are talking about the realities out there. So now, how can we address learning or teaching in the rural areas? So it's not just having what we call getting responses or getting research results from the universities. It is high time that we engage the communities themselves, the orang asli, for example, during this the very, very difficult time, when they do not have access to the internet, like we in Sabah and Sarawak. So I think the key word here is back to empowerment, engagement, and I think it is a high time that we need to engage in this, what we call the quadruple helix. Public sector, private sector, NGOs, and the community need to work together. Thank you, Dr. Amlina.
Thank you, Prof. Madeline, for highlighting the importance of really speaking to communities to understand their challenges better. YB, would you like to come in on any thoughts you may have on how we can better support?
Thank you, Dr. Manina. I think we can start first with one of the key suggestions highlighted when Ririn was making, your colleague was making the presentation. Ririn stated one of the key things with regards to our existing assistance is the sheer fragmentation. There's just been so many programs that have increased over the years, although the overall quantum for social safety, social transfers have reduced. So, you have more ministries and agencies involved, but lesser quantum. And the problem with this is it makes data integration even more elusive. And Malaysia is one of the countries that have very low levels of open data inventory. In fact, we're just having an overall score of 53 out of 100. This was in the year 2020, and I think things are slowly dawning on policymakers that you do need an integrated, shared approach vis-a-vis the database of those who are in need, those who are receiving assistance, and those who are in general, not recorded by the system. I start with the example of the floods. When we were experiencing it in the northern region, there were homes that we had to dispense with aid, even though they were not registered or placed in the Pusat Pemindahan Sementara, because it doesn't mean that they didn't suffer. It just means that not everyone suffers the same way. It's very different in terms of experiences, as we are different in terms of our background and our cultures and our, you know, our relative individual needs. Yeah. So Prof. Datuk Madeline was very clear, very right. You have to take into account all these differences, even in your management of data, because that will then translate in terms how effective you are in meeting the needs and providing the aid. I think a whole of society approach can benefit in this regard. I would have to give credit to the COVID now management. You know, you see relative openness, beginnings to make sure that data is showcased in a timely manner. That's a good benchmark to look at. But then it has to also be replicated across government agencies. So while in the private sector, you protect the right, of Malaysians towards privacy, you have issues of data integrity, so that the private sector can't easily encroach. But by the same token, within government agencies, there has to be that degree of accountability, transparency, and accessibility towards this data that affect the lives of everyone, not just Malaysians, but everyone in Malaysia. So even, I'll just give you an example, Dr. Amanina. I actually wanted to include the unrecorded workers, unregistered workers or stateless communities in the households that we were sampling. But because of COVID, it made it even worse to track them, because we felt that it was important to measure the different experiences across the spectrum. If not, but again, the best we could do is amongst the informal sector. So two things. One is to ensure greater data transparency. I think we must be clear that this is a necessary move. The government has to utilize its valuable repository of data. DOSM has to be far more open, and I work closely with them. We tried to get as much as we could, and we do appreciate Ketua Perangkawan, but I think moving forward we do need to help incentivize so that data across ministries can be shared to meet the needs of the most vulnerable. One. Number two, back to what was mentioned earlier, I think it's not enough to say that the gig economy is something that's important. It does provide for a limited sense of mobility. A lot of them would be stuck in a position where they will be in a form of control. I always call it a panopticon. I know it's not a nice term, but I think that's why when we have new legislation, inshallah, the Ministry of Human Resource stated that there will be a new legislation and amendments. I think it's not just amendments to the current Employment Act. It has to be a new Fair Work Act per se. It was been suggested by groups, think tanks at the centre. You have a Fair Work Act to govern workers, throughout the spectrum, right? It's not just about those who are in the gig economy, but there has to be people who are considered independent contractors, dependent contractors, self-employed, and only from there, when you can be able to protect them better through utilizing whatever means that they feel are most comfortable to them. I know very well the system kutu that Prof. Dr. Madeline mentioned. I was growing up, everyone was playing kutu, the neighborhood, my aunties. So certainly, right now, if self-employed workers or people in the gig economy feel that, hey, I prefer day-to-day contribution. Yeah, I feel more comfortable with that, not a monthly contribution. So must the system, be flexible to meet this need. And I think it is quite unfair to expect the whole burden to be shouldered by Perkeso it has to move also to companies to be responsible for those under their care. And this also then goes back to even the legislation introduced by the government during a pandemic when you have clusters. Hello, most of the clusters are emanating from work, related places. Workplaces are the biggest contributor of clusters, and at the end of the day, it goes back to the organizational duty of care. So not just in providing safety nets, but you also have to provide a safe work environment, not depending on government or individual responsibility alone. So I think that's why legislation is key, and to compel different sides, and the government can certainly take a credible role by first and foremost showcasing they are utilizing data in the best way possible, and they are disseminating help not just with those registered with PPS, which is what the Prime Minister just announced, but also those who have experienced terrible catastrophes in their own homes. And this is where you showcase, compassionate engagement, compassionate measurement of people suffering, coupled with empowerment, trusting them, trusting communities, trusting your local MPKKs or Ketua Kampungs with the data that they have to represent the needs of their respective communities.
The importance of access to data, as well as the need to supplement formal databases with, while also adapting to the situation on the ground, which is of course a multifaceted. Professor Yusuf, would you like to come in with your thoughts on how the floods have affected livelihoods and how we can move forward?
Thank you, Dr. Marina. Coincidentally, I found our bulletin, the label released in December 2020, as you can see here. So you can see the flood, right there, flood and employment livelihood. So in this report, people can freely download in the website of EIS. Yeah. So in this report or in this bulletin, we address is timely to consider an active assistance program that is able to compensate income and job losses due to flood events. So we have seen that flood is the annual event in Malaysia. So we need to do something. So this in this bulletin, we address, we call for different approach how to assist the affected or the victim or the flood. So, and then we posed some question relating to the consequences of flood on employment. For example, do workers have a valid reason not turning up for work? We also ask a question, what happens if a worker can come to work but they cannot perform their jobs? Another question, can employers cut wages if workers are unable to turn up for work? What should employers do following the flood? And then we also provide some talk on making flood less disastrous to workers. So in our view, there is a need to having an active assistance program, possibly in the form of employment insurance, that is able to compensate the income and job losses due to flooding. The benefit of this system is that it can reduce government fiscal burden, and then also can strengthen the active labour market policy intervention by including natural disasters in the employment insurance system, and also to increase formality of business for monetary purpose. Please read this piece of information in the website of EIS Center. Yeah. So we have addressed in 2020. Now, for your information, Dr. Amalina, we early this year, January, we plan to conduct a specific study on the income and also on the sustainability of flood victim. Unfortunately, due to MCO, we have extended the program or the survey. So maybe next few days we will go to the ground and take the data, and then we will share with the people, with the Malaysians in the next few months, I guess, after we analyze the data. Thank you, Dr. Melina.
Thank you very much, Prof. Yusuf, for sharing. And I think it is quite heartening that there has been some thinking done on this. And I guess the question is, how do we implement these great ideas? If I could stay with you, Prof. Yusuf, but pivot to a slightly different topic and a question asked by the audience. So one of the members of the audience asked, despite all of the talk about the role of informal workers, right now there is perhaps still little effort in extending labor rights and social protection for all workers, irrespective of their employment status. Even the draft of the Employment Act seems to be inadequate to protect the wide range of formal workers prevalent today. And so how can Malaysia do better for our informal workers?
You asked me, am I right?
I am asking you first. Yes.
Sorry, sometimes sel lambat sambung. Okay. Yeah. Okay, Dr. Melina, in my view, SOCSO and the government, I think they're making progressively in ensuring welfare of the people. I mean, particularly for informal workers is protected. Actually, we have to thank to COVID-19. This is the something that good. I mean, on the positive side, because it has induced our effort that previously almost ignored. Yeah, I have been criticized. I have been attacked so many times because I want to address this issue. And thanks to COVID, because it has bring more future for the informal workers and also for gig workers. If I may briefly explain what SOCSO and the government has taken the step in ensuring the protection of the workers. Yeah, of course, more information can be found in the SOCSO website and also EIS Center. Yeah, there are actually direct and indirect measures taken by SOCSO and the government for informal sectors, yeah, including gigs and including the unorganized workers. Yeah, direct measure tend to protect the gig workers, and indirect measure tend to encourage more of the informal workers to get employed in the formal sector, so that they have more income sustainability and also better working environment. Yeah, for direct measure, for example, in the budget 2022, the government has provided, I think, as 900 ringgit, yeah, to the gig workers for 6 months to benefit to vulnerable group and individual who are losing their jobs. And then beginning next year, SOCSO will rebrand their so-called SIP gigs that will specifically improve the condition of gig workers. In addition to that, I think extension of job search allowance increase the ceiling of insured employment from 4,000 to 5,000 ringgit, and then of course plus various employment or job creation program to be implemented next year. This is among the indirect measures that intend to retain and promote more formal employments, because as I mentioned at the beginning, when I answer your first question, we want to have a situation, we want to bring more unorganized or more informal workers to the formal sectors. Yeah, but not limited to the gig workers, also to informal sectors as well. Significant progress, I think we can credit to the government, because they have taken progressive effort in expanding the social security to the 9 categories of self-employed, yeah, including artists, fishermen, farmers, orang asli, and for Dr. Madeline, native Sabah and Sarawak also, the social security has been expanded to them, and also this initiative has been included in the budget 2022. Yeah, of course, more and program instrument will be developed in future to protect and improve employment condition of workers in the future. Of course, we cannot do all the initiative in one night or in 1 month or even in 1 year, because as we know that informal sectors, unorganized workers, they are very heterogeneous outside there, and then handling this issue require substantial effort and requires substantial time as well. And if moving forward, I think the system and also empowering the administrative data, one of the way we should do. I think in particular, if we address a question raised by YB Nurul Izzah on the measure of poverty, so we has been actually the way we measure poverty, I agree that we are static in nature, and then because we do not have a system or data system that could capture, could provide at least monthly poverty or monthly income losses of the people. So, but we found the way how to improve this one. In particular, if we empower the database at per case. So, for example, at this moment, if we talk about EIS, Employment Insurance System, more than I think 9 million of private sectors register under EIS system. So if we empower this database, so I don't think there's a problem in the future. We could address or we could measure poverty daily or monthly basis, and we can pinpoint each of individual. So this will reduce the blind spot in the government assistance program. I stop here. Marina, fast over.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Yusuf, for sharing some of the initiatives to protect informal workers. And I think it would be important for us to really see how these planned initiatives play out. So I have actually just one last question, and this question is for Kelvin. As we have noted in the report, learning gaps between students in socioeconomically advantaged and disadvantaged households in Malaysia exist and have widened over time. In fact, the performance gap associated to socioeconomic status is much larger in Malaysia than in other countries. Knowing this, what are your thoughts on the types of reforms and policies that can be implemented, particularly in the context of Malaysia's highly centralized education system?
Thanks, Marina. So a few things I would say. I think when it comes to reforms and policies, I believe our Ministry of Education, our policymakers are taking a lot of stride and trying to make a lot of changes in our system. I think when it comes to this topic, the easy target is the curriculum and the syllabus. But what I would actually say is our syllabus and our curriculum is pretty decent. I truly believe that our policymakers and our national education experts are acutely attuned to the needs of what our students should be learning. But it is really more of the execution of the curriculum and how we can empower our teachers, how we can empower our students a little bit better to improve in their education performance, right? So there are three things I will highlight: a student focus, an educator focus, and a systemic focus. So when it comes to student focus, I would say we need to place higher emphasis on good mindsets in the classroom and in the curriculum. So what I mean by good mindsets is resilience, growth mindset, intellectual curiosity, complex problem solving. A curriculum that focuses on continuous learning and one that rewards student proactivity. Because there are many studies have shown that student mindsets have double the effect of socioeconomic background on student outcomes. And mindsets are the single most important factor in predicting student achievement. And to give credit, all of these things are already in our curriculum. But the question is, how are we executing it? Which brings it to the next focus, which is educators. Now, once we have this in place for our students, let's do the same for our teachers. Our teachers need to exemplify the qualities that our curriculum has set for our students to learn. Because when the teachers hold a certain mindset, it translates to the action. And through the teacher's action, the students observe, and thus it shapes the student's mindset. So I would say invest in teacher training. When I say teacher training, really it's more on skills enhancement, because as a country, we invest a lot in education and we invest a lot in teacher training. But what I'm talking about here is very specific skills enhancement. Developing teachers with the right skills and knowledge to think about education differently, to depart our mindsets from rote learning into complex problem solving, to teach our teachers how to create safe spaces for students to learn. So this is the educator focus. And when it comes to systemic focus, I would say two things. Number one, we need to empower our teachers and schools with more decision-making autonomy. as they hold the most context to the students' needs and how to serve their communities better. I say this because, drawing from personal experience, a lot of times, because we work within a very centralized education system, a lot of times there is a process, there are due processes to wait for directives. But the question is, as a teacher, what are the parameters I can work with? And can we expand the parameters in which localized school administrators and teachers in the classroom can exercise to be able to make good decisions for their communities? That's number one. Number two, I would say is, if you talk about reform, I would say reform compensation and recognition schemes to enable teachers and school administrators who create success and good student outcomes in line with the policies. Now, why I say this is because I truly believe our policies are good. I subscribe to many of the education policies that our country has been set forth. But the execution of these policies have been, I would say, can be attributed to some of the gaps that we're experiencing in the education sphere in Malaysia right now. So the question is, what can we do to be able to further enable these policies? And teachers are often the biggest agents of change in the classroom. They are the ones who face the students on a daily basis. In fact, some students face the teachers more so than they face their family members. So there's a lot of opportunities for teachers to create change. And also, the question is also, what can we do to instill a culture of performance? That's where this is coming from. Are we rewarding teachers when they achieve good outcomes? The question is also, how does the system empower teachers in local communities to drive change? Are we teaching school communities to adapt? Are we institutionalizing a good mindset shift, right? Because at the moment, based on observation, we have a lot of times it's a mindset barrier when we try to create change in the communities. And so the question is also, are we teaching in a one-way manner because the system nudges us towards a certain way? Or can educators be empowered to upskill and to make good decisions for their classroom? Can educators teach the students to own their learning? Because ultimately, when it comes to a resilience in the pandemic, the students who are most successful are the ones who own their learning, the ones who possess independent learning qualities. So the question is also, how do we nurture these independent learning qualities? Again, these are elements that are already in the curriculum and the syllabus. The question is, how do we further enable and how do we execute better at a teacher, school, classroom level? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. And with that, unfortunately, that is all the time we have. Thank you to all of the panelists for a very enriching discussion. I will not be able to summarize all of it, but maybe just to mention a few points. We have discussed about the need to ensure that all vulnerable groups are covered, including the indigenous groups, orang asal, the importance of asking the community what they need, better access to data to make better policy decisions, including with regard to providing support or social assistance, supporting our informally employed workers and ensuring that they are better protected, as well as to empower our teachers and schools with more autonomy to be able to serve their students and communities better. And with that, thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to all of you for tuning in. Over to you, Zainab.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Nina, and our distinguished panelists for this lively session, and thank you to the audience for supporting and engaging in our session today. Please click the survey link or scan the QR code at the end of this event to share your thoughts about the session. In summing up the session, I would now like to invite Dr. Yasuhiko Matsuda, Country Manager for Malaysia at the World Bank Group, to give his closing remarks. Please, Yasuhiko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So on behalf of the World Bank, I would really like to thank all of you who participated in today's launch event, including our colleagues from the government, distinguished panelists, civil society, the private sector, and academia. I've been told that more than 140 people have connected today on the Facebook Live, from both Malaysia itself and abroad. The special theme of this MEM is on low-income households and vulnerable groups, including informally employed workers. Indeed, as we have heard throughout this morning, the pandemic has certainly exacerbated the burden and challenges faced by these groups. The MEM has highlighted how important it is to strengthen the existing support mechanisms to these groups, both in short and the medium terms. In addition, the MEM zoomed in on the learning challenges that have resulted from the multiple school closures we saw during this pandemic. This, of course, further underscores the need for measures to mitigate learning losses and improve the existing education system. If I may, I would like to give some highlights of what at least I have heard from the various participants in the event. First, the World Bank's country director for Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, Dr. Muhamad, highlighted that in addition to addressing the challenges faced by low-income households and vulnerable groups, and also narrowing the educational disparities, it is important for the government to undertake judicial fiscal management. This is especially so given the further narrowing of Malaysia's fiscal space due to the pandemic. In other words, Malaysia needs to collect more and spend better. In his keynote address, YB Datuk Seri Dr.Muhamad drew our attention to the signs of recovery and assured us how the government remains vigilant in ensuring the economic recovery plans remain in place. In line with the special focus of this MEM, the minister also reiterated the government's commitment to institute medium to long-term institutional reforms to build resiliency and eliminate hardcore poverty by 2025, as outlined in the 12th Malaysia Plan. The World Bank's lead economist for Malaysia, Dr. Purvasanghi, presented the bank's economic outlook for Malaysia. Economic recovery in Malaysia is expected to gain momentum in 2022, with the economy projected to expand by 5.8%. Growth is expected to be broad-based with recovery across all economic sectors. He stressed the importance of balanced fiscal measures as well, and pointed the promising roles of the proposed Fiscal Responsibility Act if designed well and complied with. He also cautioned us that there are many factors of uncertainty that indicate a number of downside risks to the projection that we have made. The second presentation we heard this morning was from the World Bank senior economist, Dr. Ririn Purnamasari. She underscored how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted poor and vulnerable Malaysian households. In addition, findings from the bank's high-frequency survey showed, as she presented, that the existing social protection system has failed to reach many among these vulnerable groups, and that the pre-existing learning gaps among children have widened. While current support measures should continue in the short term, over the long run, key reforms are needed to make both the social protection and education systems more efficient, inclusive, and resilient to future shocks. I want to thank the World Bank economist, Dr. Manina, for a great job in moderating the panel session. It was a very stimulating discussion, and obviously I will now try to summarize all the insightful and nuanced points that the panelists made during the hour-long exchange. But to me, one point that stood out, that everybody seemed to agree on, and that is that poverty and vulnerability is not just a matter of income. So first, the Professor Madeline talked passionately about the importance of including excluded communities, such as indigenous peoples, into formal systems of social protection and other government-provided assistance, but to not make it too government-centric by empowering them along multiple aspects of access, which to me was a very interesting set of concepts. YB Nurul Izzat similarly stressed multiple dimensions of poverty, which, by the way, have worsened as the MEM have shown during the pandemic. She argued for more data access and transparency as an essential way for us to understand these dimensions, while demanding accountability from government and protecting privacy of private citizens. Dr. Yusuf Sari focused on the challenges faced by informal workers, especially during the pandemic when many have resorted to informal employment as a quick way of sustaining themselves financially. He also talked about the role of the social security system in protecting workers against shocks, including climate shocks like flooding that is frequent in Malaysia. And finally, Mr. Kelvin Tan laid out challenges students have faced for almost 2 years during the school closures. Obviously, we knew about challenges of access to learning, but it was interesting to hear that a lot of students have indicated lack of self-motivation, psychological effects of social isolation as a major impediment for them to continue learning. And towards the end, he also emphasized how important it would be to focus on students' positive mindsets as a fundamental aspect for their success as students. And many more insightful, thoughtful comments, as well as a few very good questions coming from the audience. So thank you very much for all of those inputs. The World Bank will continue to provide the support for Malaysia to achieve its ambition of becoming a prosperous, inclusive, and sustainable high-income country, again, as laid out in the 12th Malaysia Plan. This is a mutual partnership where the World Bank shares our knowledge of international experiences to support policy design and implementation here in Malaysia. And at the same time, we learn from Malaysia's own policy innovations and experiences so that we can bring those lessons for the benefit of the rest of the developing world. An essential part of this partnership is to hear from a broad spectrum of Malaysian stakeholders, such as the distinguished panel we had the pleasure of hosting this morning. We're keen to continue to deepen these exciting partnerships and are very happy to have had this opportunity today to hear from you and enlighten ourselves further. Terima kasih, and back to our MC, Zainab.
Thank you, Yasuhiko, for summarizing our discussion, and thank you all who joined us live today. You may download the report from the link on the screen or from our comments section. Before you leave, we hope you will be able to share your feedback on our event via the Slido form link on the screen. Thank you all and have a good day.